Hi friends, if you're new here, welcome. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this beautiful turn of the century inspired dress. I designed this dress to be a really fun history bounding piece, something that would be versatile that you could use as both a shirtwaist and a petticoat, or as a dress on its own, or put an apron or a pinafore over it. I gotta say, this project, I had like a big mental block in the middle. There were a lot of little adjustments that needed to be made to go from a non-functional pattern to a functional pattern, and thank you to all of my pattern testers for helping me work through all of those fit issues throughout my size range. It is finally done and I'm really excited to share it with you. The Sophie dress is not 100% historically accurate to any time period. It's more of a history bounding dress with really strong elements from the turn of the century with the yoke and the puff sleeves, although the sleeve is not a historically accurate shape because mostly sleeves around the turn of the century shifted from having a lot of volume in the upper part to having a lot of volume in the lower part, and having both vertical height, not only width but vertical crown height and a poof at the bottom with that bishop sleeve shape is not something that you actually see very much. I've seen a few drawings from advertisements of shirtwaists that have a very similar sleeve shape with just a little bit less sleeve volume in about 1903. So this dress is really a modern look at a turn of the century dress. I've also shortened it slightly so it's more of a T-length. You could extend this to be full length or even shorten it to be really short to create almost like a Lolita silhouette dress. So as far as the sewing difficulty level of this pattern, I would definitely place it more in the advanced realm. It's a little bit of a longer project and it has two different kinds of plackets and then a third if you count the bias keyhole in the back. And the front placket is a little bit tricky and it's right front and center. This pattern is maybe for a detail-oriented intermediate sewist or an advanced sewist. Of course, levels are very subjective, but hopefully this video will give you a good idea of what this pattern is like. So this pattern does come with written instructions with diagrams so you can follow along. I'm going to be skipping over some of the easier, simpler steps in the instructions and really focusing more on the ones that are a little bit trickier. So first I cut out and tape together the pattern. I like to cut off one side horizontally and one side vertically to the outside of the gray line and line up all my pieces. So here I'm holding up the sleeve and it's a bit too long for me, so I am slashing and spreading the sleeve to shorten it to be about a normal sleeve length, which should work out for this sleeve. You can use this technique to shorten or lengthen the sleeve as needed. Note that the full-size pattern pieces do not include seam allowance, but the additional pieces you need to cut that are all just rectangles do include seam allowance. After I cut everything out, I cut out two cuff pieces from interfacing, cutting just inside the seam line. So rather than add seam allowance, we're actually subtracting from that seam line about a 1/16 of an inch. Then I prep the body pieces, stay stitching along the armhole and attaching the pocket pieces, understitching them and leaving that for now. Then I sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches along the top of both front and back body pieces, as well as 2 rows of gathering stitches along the sleeve crown between the notches. So I take the interfacing pieces and lay them on top of the cuffs. There are 4 cuffs and 2 interfacing pieces. So we're going to be sewing 2 of the interfacing pieces to 2 of the cuffs. So I center them on the cuffs and then pin or baste them in place. Then I sew around the edge of the interfacing going through the cuff with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. The interfaced cuff pieces are going to be on the inside so you won't see these seam lines when the cuff is worn. Then I lay 1 interfaced cuff piece and 1 non-interfaced cuff piece right sides together and sew around 3 sides. So I'm sewing the 2 straight edges and then the shorter curved side, which is concave. Then I clip the corners and the curves and turn everything right side out and press. Then I started to prepare the collar. So first we have to make the button loop, which is just this little tiny rectangle of fabric. I fold in both of the edges to the center and then fold it in half and then stitch along that edge to close it up. Because this is so small, I like to hold onto the thread tails and pull as I start to make sure that the needle doesn't shove the fabric down into the throat plate. Then I folded the little button loop in half like this and placed it on the right side of one of the collar pieces. If you want to, you can interface the collar the same way that we interface the cuffs. Personally, I didn't. I don't think it's completely necessary, but if you like to have a stiffer collar, you're welcome to do so. There should be 4 collar pieces, so they're laid right sides together in sets of 2. Then I sew around the collar, going around the curved long edge and down the short edge, and I backstitched a little bit over the button loop just to make sure that it's really secure. On the other side, you do the same thing, but there's no button loop. Then I clipped the corner and the curves of the collar and turned it right side out and pressed. Then comes the kind of fun construction part of this project. To connect the body pieces and the yoke together, I take the outside yoke and the body right sides together and gather down the body to fit in the yoke. I like to pin the center first and then pin the edges and then kind of ease the gathers in to the middle, keeping the gathers more towards the middle, leaving about 2 inches ungathered on either side. Then I like to sew these two together from the gathered side so I can be really careful about how I arrange the gathers as I sew over them. Then I take the lining side and put it right side in towards the body. So you have the wrong side of the body and the right side of the lining together. So all together you have the outer yoke and the lining yoke sandwiching the body piece. I pin the yoke lining to match up with the yoke outer piece, and so again, I like to do this from the right side and to sew a little bit farther into the seam allowance so that the original seam that I sewed, where I was being really careful about how I placed my gathers, is the seam that shows on the outside when the garment is finished. This is where if you wanted to skip a step and sandwich the body in between both layers and just sew all at once, it's just a little bit harder to be really careful and intentional about how you sew over your gathers when they're hidden between 2 layers. So that's why I like to do it in 2 steps, but you can also just do it as 1 step. So I do this with the front body, front yoke, and front yoke lining, as well as the back body, back yoke, and back yoke lining. Then comes the fun burrito part. So to do this, I'm rolling up one of the body pieces. It doesn't matter which one you start with because you do the same thing on both. Rolling it up so it's all compact and then opening up those 2 yoke pieces. Then I do the same thing on the other side, rolling up the body and opening up the yoke pieces, and this allows you to place the shoulder seams of the front and back yoke outer and the front and back yoke lining right sides together because the body pieces are all compressed. The body pieces are in the middle and then the yoke is able to go right sides together, outer fabric to outer fabric and lining fabric to lining fabric. And then you can go ahead and sew your shoulder seams with everything rolled up like this. And once it's done, you should be able to pull everything out and get something that looks like this, where you have a clean seam connecting the yoke pieces to the body and also connecting the shoulder seams. So then I like to go in and press the shoulder seams open to make everything lay nice and flat. So now that the yokes are assembled in the outer fabric and the lining fabric, we can start on all of the neckline details, of which there are kind of a lot. You can pin or baste the outer and lining yokes together just to make sure that nothing is shifting, and go ahead and mark out, if you haven't already, the back keyhole. Then I sew around the keyhole just outside of it about 1/4 inch, connecting the outer and lining yoke pieces. Then I cut open the keyhole and bind this edge with a bias strip. So there are 2 ways to do this. You can either sew it on the outside first and then turn it to the inside and finish by hand, which is what I did. You can also sew it on the inside first, turn it to the outside, and top stitch, which is going to be much faster and not include hand sewing. I find that the top stitching way is much easier to get clean than trying to stitch in the ditch. Then moving on to the front placket. This is the tricky one. First we mark out a rectangle like this. It's 4.5 inches long and 1/2 inch wide. There's a diagram for this in the instructions. Then I draw a line down the center into a little Y at the bottom that connects to the corners. Before cutting anything, I'm going to sew a line of stitching around the outer edge of the rectangle. Then I cut down the middle in that shape of a Y so that I can pull it and have that stitching line become a completely straight line. Then I'm taking the front placket piece and lining it up with this edge, and this is where you again have 2 options. You can either sew it on the outside first and then turn it to the inside and finish by hand, or you can try to stitch in the ditch, but I don't really recommend it. Or you can sew it to the inside first and then bring it to the outside and top stitch. So I'm sewing it on the outside first and then pressing everything, including the seam allowances, out towards the placket, folding the other edge of the placket under 1/4 inch, and then folding it in half and finishing by hand. So here you should have a placket that fills the entire width of the original rectangle that we drew. So the placket should be 1/2 inch wide and the original rectangle should also be 1/2 inch wide. Now to fold the placket up. I'm starting with one side straight up vertically the way that it normally sits, and then bringing the other side so the placket comes out at a 90-degree angle, and then creasing the bottom of the placket like that. Then I bring the side that was down up to meet the other side and creasing the bottom so that it's symmetrical and you get that nice 90-degree angle point at the bottom. This is where it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're trying to do this by machine, especially if you have a machine that doesn't do well with thick layers. So the easiest way to get this clean, in my experience, and some of my pattern testers' experience, is to hand sew it. So to do kind of invisible felling stitches around the edge of this placket, and then making sure you have some strong stitches right where that's going to open. You could also hand sew and then machine sew over it. If you just want to machine sew this and avoid hand sewing, what I might recommend is to actually make the entire placket a little bit wider. So to go like 3/4 of an inch wide instead of 1/2 inch wide. To do that, I'll put up the diagrams and measurements you would need for that. Basically, you draw out your rectangle, whatever width you want, and then all you need to do is create a placket that fills the entire width of the rectangle. So whatever it is, if it was 1 inch, you just need to create a placket that's 1 inch. So I like to use the edge that we cut when we cut open the placket as the seam allowance guide. So whatever the width of the rectangle is, half of that is your seam allowance, and then the rest is the width. So basically, you need to cut your placket 3 times the width that you want it to end up, because 2 are folded over and then 2 halves for the seam allowances. Hopefully that makes sense. You can do this kind of folding and you should come up with something that looks like this. So then I think I stay stitched around the neckline just because my layers were kind of moving around. I wanted to really keep them in place, and then now it's time to sew on the collar. So I'm pinning and carefully easing the collar around the neckline, and then I carefully sew each side of the collar on, making sure to not cross into the other side of my collar or the seam allowances at those corners. So I like to use the hand crank on my machine to be really careful when starting and stopping at the beginning and end of these seams. And I like to only sew the outside of the collar to the neckline and then finish the inside by hand. So I sew by machine and then trim the seam allowance down to a little over 1/4 of an inch, press everything up, and then press the inside edge of the collar under by hand, pin and whip stitch it down. I also decided to add some pick stitching both around the collar with little over 1/16 of an inch seam allowance, and also around the cuffs with more like 3/16 of an inch seam allowance. You could also top stitch, or you can just leave it plain, it's up to you. So then I sewed the side seams, just laying the front and back body right sides together. I would recommend finishing the seam with overlocking. Did I finish my seam? No, I did not. You could also finish it with a French seam if you want. But one thing about this seam is that it has a pocket and it's also a bias seam. So what I like to do is take some thin tape. You could use the salvage edge of your fabric cut off, you could use twill tape, you could use ribbon, anything that is strong and has those long on-grain fibers should be okay. I sew the side seam, stopping and back stitching for the pocket opening and leaving a gap, and then continuing, and then I sew around the pocket, and then I go up the side seam above the pocket again, but sewing on this tape to reinforce the seam. Moving on to the sleeves. So to create the sleeve plackets, and actually if you want to leave these off and not do a sleeve placket, technically you can. Because of how long the cuff is, you should be able to put it on without having an opening past the cuff. But here's how you would do it if you wanted to. So I cut the little slit in the sleeve, and then to bind the placket, again, you can do this the same way that the other 2 plackets are, either finishing by hand or finishing by machine. So here I'm gonna do it the machine version. So I'm lining up the right side of the sleeve placket with the wrong side of the sleeve and pulling that sleeve placket straight. The middle, you have almost no seam allowance, but then the edges, I use about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So sewing down the sleeve placket and then trimming off any excess placket, pressing the edges out towards the placket, pressing the placket edge under about 1/4 of an inch, and then folding the placket in half and top stitching along that edge. Then I fold the whole sleeve right sides together along the placket and sew a diagonal line going from the top of the placket down. Then I close the sleeve with a narrow French seam. To attach the cuff, I sewed 2 rows of gathering stitches around the end of the sleeve, starting at the placket and ending at the placket. I gathered the sleeve down to fit into the cuff and sewed the outer side of the cuff right sides together with the sleeve, being careful at those corners again, then trimming down the seam allowance, pressing everything into the cuff, folding the edge of the cuff under, and whip stitching it down by hand for an invisible finish. Here you could also do it the opposite way to do it entirely by machine. So you can sew the lining side of the cuff to the wrong side of the sleeve and then finish the top
by top stitching, and that way you can be really careful about your top stitching and not have to worry about if you're catching a layer underneath or not, because the underneath has already been sewn. So then to set in the sleeves, lining up the notches, the double notch in the back and the single notch in the front, and easing the sleeve in to fit. Then I gather down the top of the sleeve head to ease that in as well, and carefully sew around the entire thing. This is another seam that is really good one to finish with overlocking if you can, or with a zigzag stitch, that works as well. Then I created and attached the ruffle and created a belt, which is really just a long strip that is finished. I sewed one end of the tube shut and then sewed down the tube, turned it right side out, and finished the other end by hand. There are many ways to make a belt. You could top stitch it as well. For the buttons and buttonholes, I recommend doing at least 5 buttons on each cuff, and then doing at least 3, I like to do 4, on the front placket, and 1 on the collar, and then 1 for the back. I will say it's a good idea to make sure that your button fits through the button loop before you sew it on to the collar. Back when we did that, you know, if you have buttons that you really want to use, it would be a shame if you accidentally sew the loop too small. So it's always a good thing to check. That is this dress complete. Another thing I'll say is you can do some really fun color blocking with this pattern. In my first test sample, I did color blocking like this, and a lot of you really liked it. Honestly, I really liked it too. I put a lot of effort into creating the color blocking, which is probably more effort than one should put in when making a first sample of a pattern. So this can be a really good project to use up some like larger linen scraps you might have. That is pretty much everything about this pattern. I also recently put out a turn of the century chemise pattern, which is much simpler and much more beginner friendly than this pattern, so you can go check out my pattern store if you would like to. That is all I have for you today. Let me know what you think of this design. Let me know what you want to see from me in the future in the comments below. And I will see you next time. Bye! That was so unsatisfying. It was the most unsatisfying yawn I've had in like an hour. Okay.